Commander Vexthar had conquered 17 star systems during his long career in the Kelrani Dominion fleet, and he had never once felt fear when facing an enemy species. But something about the invitation from the humans made his secondary heart beat faster than usual. The message had arrived 3 cycles ago through official diplomatic channels, and it was simple enough in its wording, stating that the Human Alliance would be honored to host a delegation from the Kelrani Dominion at their prestigious military training facility known as West Point Academy. Vexthar stood on the bridge of his personal cruiser as it entered the Sol system, and he watched the blue planet grow larger on the view screen, while his adjutant, Kiraven, reviewed the intelligence briefings beside him. The humans were a curious species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 60 years ago, and they were still confined to their single solar system, with only a few small colonies on nearby moons and planets. By all accounts, they should have been insignificant, just another primitive race waiting to be absorbed into the Dominion's ever-expanding territory. But the High Council had insisted on this diplomatic mission before making any decisions about humanity's future. "Commander, the human escort vessels are approaching," Kiraven reported, her mandibles clicking softly as she processed the sensor data. "They are sending welcoming messages on all frequencies." Vexthar studied the human ships with a dismissive gaze, noting their relatively small size and basic weapon configurations, and he wondered why the Council had bothered sending someone of his rank to evaluate such an obviously inferior civilization. "Respond with standard diplomatic protocols," he ordered, "and prepare my shuttle for departure once we achieve orbit." The journey down through Earth's atmosphere was uneventful, and Vexthar used the time to review what little information the Dominion had gathered about human military traditions. They apparently valued something called honor very highly, and they trained their warriors from a young age in dedicated facilities scattered across their home world, with West Point being one of the oldest and most respected among them. The shuttle touched down on a gray stone courtyard, surrounded by old brick buildings that seemed almost primitive compared to Kelrani architecture, and Vexthar straightened his ceremonial armor before stepping out into the Earth's sunlight. A group of humans waited to greet him, all dressed in matching gray uniforms with shiny metal decorations on their chests, and at their head stood a female who stepped forward with her hand extended in what Vexthar knew was a human greeting gesture. "Commander Vexthar, I am Colonel Maria Santos, Superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point," she said in a voice that carried no trace of fear or intimidation, despite standing before an alien warrior twice her size. "On behalf of the Human Alliance and the Academy, I welcome you to Earth." Vexthar carefully took her small hand in his massive claw and shook it gently, mindful of his strength, and he noticed that her grip was surprisingly firm for such a fragile-looking creature. "Colonel Santos, I thank you for this invitation and look forward to learning about your training methods," he replied through his translator device. The colonel smiled, and Vexthar noticed that the expression did not quite reach her eyes, which remained sharp and calculating as they studied him in return. "We have prepared a full week of activities for you and your delegation," she continued, gesturing toward the buildings behind her. "But I thought we might start with our history museum, as I find that understanding a species' past helps illuminate their present and future." Vexthar agreed to this suggestion, thinking it over carefully. Would be a quick tour of whatever minor conflicts had shaped human civilization, and he followed Santos into the largest of the stone buildings, while Kiraven recorded everything with her optical implants. The museum entrance was grand by human standards, with high ceilings and walls lined with paintings depicting humans in various military uniforms throughout different eras. And Vexthar noted that the images showed weapons evolving from simple bladed implements to increasingly complex devices. "Humanity has a long relationship with warfare," Santos explained as she led them deeper into the exhibits. We have been fighting each other since before we developed written language, and we have never really stopped. Vexstar clicked his mandibles in what passed for a Kelrani chuckle, thinking that this was not unusual, as most species went through violent phases before achieving spacefaring civilization, and he expected the humans would soon present their more peaceful side. Modern era. They passed displays of ancient warriors wearing metal armor and carrying swords, then through sections showing soldiers with early chemical propellant weapons that seemed almost laughably primitive, and Vexstar began to wonder if this tour would ever show anything interesting. Then they entered a large hall with the words "World Wars" carved above the doorway, and everything changed. The first thing Vexstar noticed was the scale of the displays, which stretched across multiple walls and included massive photographs of destruction that rivaled anything he had seen during actual planetary invasions. These conflicts occurred during our 20th century, Santos said, her voice remaining completely neutral, as if she were discussing the weather. The first one lasted 4 years and killed approximately 20 million people, and the second one lasted 6 years and killed between 70 and 85 million. Vexstar stopped walking and turned to stare at the human female, certain that his translator had malfunctioned. "I apologize, but could you repeat those numbers?" he asked. 20 million deaths in the first conflict, and 70 to 85 million in the second, Santos replied without hesitation. "These are conservative estimates, and some historians believe the true numbers were higher." Kiraven made a soft choking sound beside him, and Vexstar felt his primary heart skip several beats as he tried to comprehend what he was hearing. "These wars were fought against an invading species from another world," he asked, searching for some explanation that made sense. Santos shook her head slowly, and that same cold smile appeared on her face again. "No, Commander. These wars were fought between human nations against other human nations, and the dead were almost entirely human beings, killed by other human beings." Vexstar looked at the images on the walls with new eyes. Trenches filled with bodies, cities reduced to rubble, and fields covered with the twisted remains of primitive vehicles. And he realized that all of this carnage had been inflicted by humans upon themselves. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Many reasons," Santos replied, beginning to walk again and forcing Vexstar to follow. "Territory, resources, ideology, religion, nationalism, or sometimes simply because one group of humans decided they did not like another group of humans." She paused before a display, showing a massive mushroom-shaped cloud rising above a devastated city. "This is the moment we became capable of destroying ourselves entirely," she said. "We developed nuclear weapons during the Second World War and used them twice against an enemy nation, killing approximately 200,000 people in 2 explosions. Vexstar stared at the image and felt something he had not experienced in over 40 years of military. He felt afraid. "You created weapons capable of destroying entire cities," he said slowly, "during an internal conflict." "Yes," Santos confirmed, "and we have improved them considerably since then, as our current nuclear arsenal could sterilize every inhabited world in this sector of the galaxy if we chose to use it." She turned to face him directly, and Vexstar saw no pride in her eyes, only a deep and weary acceptance of a terrible truth about her own species. "We are very good at war, Commander Vexstar," she said quietly. "It may be the thing we are best at as a species, and we have spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other in increasingly efficient ways." She gestured toward the next section of the museum. "Shall we continue, as there is much more to see?" Vexstar followed her deeper into the museum, and with each step, he felt his confidence in Kelrani superiority crumbling away like sand before a rising tide. The tour of the Human History Museum continued for another 2 hours, and with each passing minute, Commander Vexstar felt his understanding of the universe shifting beneath his feet like unstable ground during a planetary quake. Colonel Santos led them through exhibit after exhibit, each one documenting another conflict in humanity's seemingly endless catalog of violence against itself, and the numbers kept growing larger until they lost all meaning. Korea had claimed 5 million lives, and Vietnam had taken 3 million more, and these were considered minor conflicts by human standards that barely warranted their own sections in the museum. The Middle East alone had produced so many wars that the humans had stopped giving them individual names, and simply referred to them by the regions where they occurred, and the combined death toll stretched into the tens of millions. "I notice you have not mentioned any wars against other species," Vexstar said, paused before a display of chemical weapons that had been banned by human law, after proving too horrifying even for this violent species. "That is because we have not fought any yet," Santos replied, and there was something in her tone that made Vexstar's mandibles freeze in place. "All of this destruction was practice, Commander." Kiravan had stopped recording at some point, and now simply stood beside Vexstar with her eyes wide and her breathing rapid, showing signs of what the Kelrani Medical Corps called acute psychological distress. "Perhaps we should take a brief rest," Vexstar suggested, more for his adjutant's sake than his own, though he would not have refused a moment to collect his thoughts. Santos nodded and led them to a small courtyard outside the museum, where stone benches surrounded a fountain, and the peaceful sound of water seemed almost mocking given what they had just witnessed inside. Santos said as she sat across from him on one of the benches, "Humans do not enjoy war, and we do not celebrate the deaths I have shown you today." "Then why show me at all?" Vexstar asked. "Because you came here to assess our military capabilities, and I believe in honest dealing between potential allies," Santos replied. "You needed to understand what we are before we discuss what we could become together." A group of young humans in cadet uniforms walked past the courtyard, laughing and talking among themselves like any group of young people in any civilization, and Vexstar found it almost impossible to reconcile their innocent appearance with the horrors their species had inflicted upon itself. "Those cadets," he said, gesturing toward the retreating group, "will they become warriors?" "They already are warriors," Santos corrected him. "They began their training here 8 months ago, and by the time they graduate, they will be capable of leading human soldiers into any conflict, against any enemy, under any conditions." 8 months. Kiravan spoke for the first time since entering the museum, her voice shaky. "Kelrani combat officers require 4 years of training at minimum." "We do not have 4 years to spare," Santos said simply. "Human lifespans are short by galactic standards, so we have learned to train quickly and efficiently." She stood and brushed invisible dust from her uniform, and Vexstar noticed that her movements were precise and economical, with no wasted motion, like a predator conserving energy between hunts. "Would you like to observe some of our training exercises?" she asked. "I believe seeing our cadets in action will give you a better understanding of human military doctrine than any museum exhibit." Vexstar agreed, partly out of diplomatic obligation, and partly because he could not quite believe that the soft-looking creatures he had seen walking past could possibly be the heirs to such a violent legacy. They walked across the academy grounds toward a large field where organized chaos seemed to be unfolding, with groups of cadets running in formation while others practiced combat techniques on padded dummies. An older human male approached and saluted Colonel Santos with crisp precision, before turning his attention to the alien visitors. "Commander Vexstar, this is Sergeant Major Luis Ortega," Santos introduced him. "He oversees our physical combat training programs." Ortega was shorter than Santos, but considerably wider, with muscles visible even through his uniform, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. And his eyes held the same calculating coldness that Vexstar had noticed in the colonel. "Honored to meet you, Commander," Ortega said, though his tone suggested he was neither honored nor particularly interested. "The colonel mentioned you might want to see some demonstrations." if it would not disrupt. "Your training schedule," Vexstar replied. Ortega made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it held no humor that Vexstar could detect. "Nothing disrupts my training schedule, Commander, because my cadets train under all conditions, expected and unexpected, and surprise visitors are just another variable they need to learn to handle." He turned and shouted something in a human language that Vexstar's translator rendered as a string of creative insults, questioning the cadets' ancestry and intelligence, and immediately the entire field snapped to attention. "Cadet Brooks," Ortega called out, "front and center." A young human male jogged forward and stopped before them, standing perfectly straight with his eyes focused on some point in the distance, and Vexstar studied him with growing disbelief. The cadet could not have been more than 17 or 18 years old by human reckoning, with short brown hair and a face that still carried the softness of youth, and he looked about as threatening as a newly hatched Kelrani larva. "Cadet Kevin Brooks is one of our most promising first-year students," Santos explained. "He scored in the top percentile on all physical and mental evaluations." "With respect, Colonel," Vexstar said carefully, "this child does not appear capable of posing a threat to anyone." Something flickered in Santos' eyes, and for just a moment, Vexstar thought he saw amusement there. "Sergeant Major, would you set up a demonstration with the Mark 7 combat drone?" Ortega nodded and barked more orders, and several cadets wheeled out a humanoid machine that stood nearly as tall as Vexstar himself, with multiple articulated limbs and sensors that glowed with active power. "The Mark 7 is programmed with combat patterns from 17 different known species," Santos explained, "including preliminary data we have gathered on Kelrani fighting techniques." His mandibles twitched at this casual admission that the humans had been studying his people's combat methods. But before he could comment, Ortega had activated the drone and stepped back. "Begin," Santos commanded. What happened next would haunt Vexstar's dreams for the rest of his life. The young cadet moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a creature with such a soft and fragile body, flowing around the drone's attacks like water around stones in a stream. He did not fight like a Kelrani warrior, using strength and armor to overwhelm an opponent, but instead found angles and weaknesses that should not have existed, striking at joints and sensors with devastating accuracy. In less than 30 seconds, the Mark 7 lay in pieces on the ground, its armored shell breached in multiple locations, and Cadet Brooks stood over it, breathing only slightly harder than when he had started. "Drill complete, Sergeant Major," then returned to his position of attention, as if he had done nothing remarkable. Vexstar stared at the destroyed drone, and then at the young human who had dismantled it, and he understood with terrible clarity that he had badly underestimated this species. "He is 17 years old," Santos said quietly. "Give him another 3 years of training, and he will be capable of killing a fully armored Kelrani warrior with nothing but his hands." She met Vexstar's gaze directly. "We have studied your species quite thoroughly since first contact, Commander, and we study everyone we meet, because that is simply what we do." Vexstar wanted to ask why, wanted to demand an explanation for this obsessive preparation for conflicts that might never occur. But deep down he already knew the answer. Humans prepared for war the way other species breathed, automatically and constantly, because thousands of years of killing each other had taught them that peace was only temporary. Ever temporary. "Shall we continue to our strategy center?" Santos asked. "I think you will find our war games particularly educational." Vexstar followed her across the field, very aware that every cadet they passed was watching him with those same cold, calculating eyes, measuring him, assessing his weaknesses, and filing away the information for future use. The strategy center was located in a building that looked old on the outside, but hummed with advanced technology on the inside. and Vexthar found himself surrounded by holographic displays and computing systems that rivaled anything the Kelrani Dominion had developed. Colonel Santos led them into a large circular room where a dozen senior cadets sat at control stations arranged around a central projection area, and the air crackled with focused concentration as the young humans manipulated data streams with practiced ease. "This is our primary tactical simulation facility," Santos explained. "Our senior cadets spend hundreds of hours here running combat scenarios against artificial intelligence opponents programmed with the military doctrines of every known spacefaring species." A human male in his mid-20s approached and nodded respectfully to Santos before turning his attention to Vexthar. "Commander, I am Lieutenant Daniel Costa, and I oversee the simulation training programs here at the Academy," he said. "We were just about to begin a new scenario if you would like to observe." "What sort of scenario?" Vexthar asked, though part of him suspected he already knew the answer. Costa exchanged a glance with Santos, who gave a small nod of permission. "We have been running simulations of defensive actions against a potential Kelrani invasion fleet," Costa said, without any apparent embarrassment. "It has proven to be an excellent teaching exercise for our cadets." Vexthar felt his mandibles click together sharply, a Kelrani expression of displeasure that he normally kept under tight control during diplomatic functions. "You have been simulating warfare against the Kelrani Dominion," he said flatly. "Against every major power in the known galaxy," Santos corrected him. "The Syndicate, the Morath Collective, the Vreen Hierarchy, and yes, the Kelrani Dominion, because we believe in being prepared for any eventuality, How did you obtain sufficient information about our military capabilities to create accurate simulations?" Vexthar demanded. Costa pulled up a holographic display showing a detailed breakdown of Kelrani ship classifications, weapon systems, and tactical formations, and Vexthar recognized every single element as accurate down to the smallest detail. "Open source intelligence primarily," Costa explained. "Your species broadcast its military victories across multiple communication frequencies, and we have been recording and analyzing everything since first contact 3 years ago." He gestured at the display with something that might have been pride or might have been warning. "We know your standard fleet compositions, your preferred engagement distances, your command structure protocols, and your most commonly used tactical doctrines, and we have developed countermeasures for all of them." Vexthar stood in stunned silence, as then implications of this revelation washed over him like a cold tide. The Kelrani Dominion had spent centuries building a reputation as the most feared military power in their region of the galaxy, and they had done so by making examples of any species foolish enough to challenge them. Their victories were broadcast widely and intentionally, meant to intimidate potential enemies into submission before any actual fighting became necessary, and this strategy had worked perfectly for generations. But the humans had not been intimidated by those broadcasts. They had studied them. "Perhaps a demonstration would help illustrate our methodology," Santos suggested, and at her signal, the cadets at the control stations began activating their systems. The central projection area flickered to life with a three-dimensional representation of a star system that Vexthar did not recognize, showing a human colony world defended by a modest fleet of ships that looked painfully inadequate compared to the Kelrani invasion force appearing at the edge of the display. "This scenario assumes a standard Kelrani conquest fleet," Costa narrated. 12 heavy cruisers, 36 medium escorts, and approximately 200 fighter craft, which is the typical composition your Dominion uses for subjugating single-system civilizations. The human defense fleet consisted of perhaps 20 ships, none of which matched the size or apparent firepower of the Kelrani cruisers, and Vexthar expected the simulation to end quickly and decisively in the Dominion's favor. "Begin simulation," Costa ordered. What followed was unlike any battle Vexthar had ever witnessed. The human fleet did not advance to meet the Kelrani forces in honorable combat, as his people would have expected. but instead retreated toward the system's asteroid belt, while launching waves of small unmanned craft that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. "Those drones are sensor platforms," one of the cadets explained when she noticed Vexstar's confusion. "They are mapping the exact positions of your fleet and feeding targeting data back to our main ships." The Kelrani fleet pursued as any commander would have done, moving into the asteroid belt, where their superior numbers and firepower should have guaranteed victory. And then the humans triggered their trap. Nuclear detonations erupted throughout the asteroid field, not aimed at the Kelrani ships directly, but at the asteroids themselves, shattering them into millions of high-velocity fragments that tore through the invasion fleet like shrapnel through soft tissue. "Your ships are heavily armored against energy weapons and standard projectiles," Costa observed. "But that armor becomes a liability when you are hit by an expanding sphere of rock fragments moving at significant fractions of light speed." On the display, the Kelrani heavy cruisers were breaking apart, breached in dozens of locations by debris that no amount of shielding could have stopped, and the human ships emerged from protected positions to pick off the survivors. The entire battle lasted less than 15 minutes by the simulation's internal clock, and when it ended, the Kelrani invasion fleet had been completely destroyed, while human losses totaled 4 ships and approximately 600 personnel. "Scenario complete," the lead cadet announced. "Human forces achieved 93% survival rate against total Kelrani force elimination." Vexstar stared at the display, showing the wreckage of what would have been one of the Dominion's finest fleets, and he felt something cold settling in his chest. "This is one variation of 47 we have developed for defensive actions against Kelrani incursions," Costa continued. "Our overall success rate across all scenarios averages approximately 91%. "You have been planning to fight us," Vexstar said, his voice barely audible. "All this time while offering friendship and cultural exchange, you have been planning to fight us." Santos moved to stand beside him, and her voice was calm, but carried an edge of something that might have been regret. "No, Commander, we have been planning to win, and there is a significant difference." She gestured toward another display showing ground combat simulations, and Vexstar watched as human soldiers systematically dismantled Kelrani defensive positions, using tactics that exploited weaknesses he had not even known existed. "We do not want war with the Kelrani Dominion," Santos continued. "We are not conquerors by nature, whatever our violent history might suggest, and we genuinely hope to establish peaceful relations with your people." "Then why all of this?" Vexstar gestured at the simulation center with a sweep of his claw. "Why spend years preparing to destroy us if you want peace?" For a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of thousands of years of human experience. "Because we have learned through bitter experience that the best way to prevent war is to make victory impossible for any potential enemy," she said. "We study every species we encounter, we analyze their capabilities, and we develop strategies to defeat them. Not because we intend to use those strategies, but because knowing we could use them gives us the freedom to pursue peace from a position of strength." She met his gaze directly, and Vexstar saw no malice in her eyes, only a deep and tired understanding of the universe's harsh realities. "We are a very dangerous species, Commander Vexstar, and we know this about ourselves, which is why we work so hard to be something better than what our history suggests we could be." She gestured toward the exit. "Perhaps you have seen enough for today, as we have prepared quarters for you and your adjutant, and tomorrow we can discuss the actual purpose of your visit, which I believe involves evaluating humanity for potential alliance or absorption into the Kelrani Dominion." Vexstar followed her out of the simulation center, and he tried not to think about the fact that somewhere in the Academy's computers there existed detailed plans for dismantling everything the Kelrani had built over the past 1,000 years. These humans were something new in his experience, a species that had somehow transformed their greatest weakness into their greatest strength, and he was no longer certain that the Kelrani Dominion was ready for what that might mean. Vexthar did not sleep that night, and instead he sat in the quarters the humans had provided and stared at the wall while his mind churned through everything he had witnessed. Kiraven had retreated to her own room hours ago, clearly overwhelmed by the day's revelations, and Vexthar could not blame her for needing time to process what they had learned. He had come to Earth expecting to find a primitive species ripe for conquest, or at best, worthy of being offered protectorate status under Kelrani rule. And instead, he had discovered something that defied everything he thought he understood about civilizations. The humans were young by galactic standards, barely a heartbeat in the cosmic time frame, and yet they had already developed military capabilities that could threaten powers thousands of years their senior. More troubling was the way they had achieved this, not through stolen technology or alliances with older species, but simply by being very good at killing each other for a very long time. A chime at his door interrupted his thoughts, and Vexthar rose to find Colonel Santos standing in the corridor with 2 cups of steaming liquid in her hands. "I thought you might appreciate some company," she said. "Human custom dictates that difficult conversations go better with coffee, though I have no idea if your biology can process caffeine." Vexthar accepted the cup more out of politeness than any desire to consume human beverages, and he gestured for Santos to enter his quarters. They sat across from each other in the small sitting area, and for a long moment neither spoke, simply existing together in the quiet of the academy night. "You are troubled by what you have seen," Santos said finally, making it a statement rather than a question. "I am a warrior who has conquered 17 star systems," Vexthar replied. "I have faced enemies that would give most species nightmares, and I have never felt what I felt today in your museum and your simulation center." Santos nodded slowly, and Vexthar noticed that she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "We have that effect on people," she said. "Most species react with either fear or disbelief when they learn about our history, and I have yet to decide which reaction is more appropriate." "Why did you show me all of this?" Vexthar asked. "You could have presented a sanitized version of human history, emphasized your peaceful achievements, hidden your military capabilities behind diplomatic niceties. But instead, you showed me everything." "Because deception would have been pointless," Santos replied, taking a sip of her coffee. "You came here to assess us for potential conquest, and we knew that from the moment we received your diplomatic request." Vexthar's mandibles clicked in surprise, and Santos smiled at his reaction. "We intercepted and decrypted your military communications months ago," she continued. "We know that the Kelrani High Council views humanity as either a potential vassal species or a resource to be exploited, and we decided that honesty was our best defense." "Honesty," Vexthar repeated. "If we had hidden our capabilities, you would have reported back that humanity was weak and ready for absorption, and your council would have sent a conquest fleet," Santos explained. "By showing you exactly what we are capable of, we give you the information you need to make a different recommendation." She leaned forward, and her eyes held that same calculating intensity that Vexthar had seen in every human he had encountered. "We do not want war with the Kelrani Dominion, Commander, but we will fight one if we must, and we will win, and both of us know it now." Vexthar set down his untouched coffee and studied the human female who had effectively dismantled his entire worldview in the span of a single meeting. "You speak as if victory is certain," he said. "The Kelrani Dominion controls hundreds of systems with resources and industrial capacity that dwarf anything humanity possesses." "Numbers and resources matter," Santos agreed. "But they are not the only factors that determine victory in warfare." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the academy grounds where the night lights cast long shadows across the ancient stone buildings. Humanity has a saying that wars are not won by the side with the most soldiers or the best weapons, but by the side that refuses to lose, she said. We have been refusing to lose for thousands of years, against enemies that should have destroyed us, against obstacles that should have been insurmountable, and against our own worst impulses. She turned back to face him. Your dominion is powerful, Commander. But power without adaptability is brittle, and we have watched your people make the same tactical decisions, over and over again, for centuries, without ever considering that someone might learn from your patterns. Vexthar thought about the simulation he had witnessed, how the humans had turned the Kelrani fleet's own pursuit instincts against them, and he realized that Santos was right. His people had grown complacent in their superiority, relying on strength and numbers rather than innovation, and they had broadcast their methods so widely that any sufficiently motivated species could study them. The humans were sufficiently motivated. What do you want from this exchange? Vexthar asked. You have shown me your strength, made your warnings clear, but surely you have some goal beyond simply terrifying a visiting dignitary. Santos returned to her seat and folded her hands in front of her, and for the first time, Vexthar saw something other than calculation in her expression. We want alliance, Commander. Genuine partnership between our species based on mutual respect and shared goals. Alliance, Vexthar repeated, testing the word. The Kelrani Dominion does not form alliances with species we could conquer. Then perhaps it is time for the Dominion to reconsider its policies, Santos replied, because we are not a species you could conquer, not without paying a price so high that victory would be meaningless. She leaned forward. Humanity offers something that conquest cannot provide, a partner species that thinks differently, solves problems differently, and approaches warfare in ways that could benefit the Dominion enormously. You are suggesting that we should ally with you because of your military capabilities, Vexthar said. I am suggesting that you should ally with us because we could help each other become something greater than either of us could be alone, Santos corrected him. The galaxy is full of threats that neither humans nor Kelrani have encountered yet, and when those threats emerge, would you rather face them with humanity as your enemy or your friend? The question hung in the air between them, and Vexthar found himself genuinely considering it for the first time since arriving on Earth. He had spent his entire career viewing other species through the lens of conquest, measuring their value by how easily they could be subjugated, or how useful they might be as servants. But Santos was offering something different, a partnership of equals. The concept was foreign to Kelrani thinking, almost heretical in its implications. But sitting here in this human room, surrounded by evidence of human capability, Vexthar could not dismiss it as foolishness. I will include your proposal in my report to the High Council, he said finally. Santos nodded, and something that might have been relief flickered across her features. That is all we ask, Commander. A fair hearing and an honest assessment of what humanity could offer as an ally, rather than an adversary. Then a subject. She stood and moved toward the door. Get some rest if you can, because tomorrow I would like to show you some of the things humanity has achieved when we direct our energy toward building rather than destroying. And I think you may find it equally illuminating. She paused at the threshold. We are not monsters, Commander Vexthar, despite what our history might suggest, and we are capable of tremendous good when given the opportunity. She left him alone with his thoughts, and Vexthar sat in the darkness for a long time, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The Kelrani Dominion had built its empire on the assumption that strength was the only thing that mattered in the universe, and for 1,000 years that assumption had proven correct. But humanity represented something new, a species that had matched Kelrani's strength through sheer determined savagery, and then channeled that savagery into preparation and planning. and patience. They were not the primitive children Vexthar had expected to find. They were something far more dangerous, and potentially far more valuable. The journey back to Kelrani space took 3 standard cycles, and Vexthar spent most of that time in his private quarters reviewing the data Kiraven had collected, and trying to compose a report that would accurately convey what he had witnessed without causing panic throughout the Dominion. He failed repeatedly. Every attempt to describe humanity in measured diplomatic terms fell short of the reality, and every attempt to express the full truth sounded like the ravings of a commander who had lost his grip on sanity. In the end, he simply organized his observations into categories and resolved to let the High Council draw their own conclusions, though he suspected those conclusions would be the same as his own. The council chamber was vast and ancient, built in the early days of Kelrani expansion, when the Dominion's founders had dreamed of ruling the entire galaxy, and its walls were decorated with the symbols of every species that had fallen before Kelrani. Vexthar stood at the speaker's podium and looked up at the assembled council members, their carapaces gleaming in the ceremonial lighting, and he knew that what he was about to say would change everything. Honored Council, I was sent to assess the military capabilities of the species known as humans, and to recommend whether they should be offered protectorate status or targeted for direct conquest, he began, his voice steady despite the churning in his secondary stomach. I am here to report that neither option is viable. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the chamber, and High Counselor Zaravek leaned forward on her throne with obvious displeasure. Explain yourself, Commander, she demanded. Are you suggesting that a single-system species barely 60 years into their spacefaring era poses a threat to the Kelrani Dominion? I am suggesting that any hostile action against human civilization would result in the effective destruction of our military capacity and possibly the collapse of the Dominion itself, Vexthar replied. The chamber erupted in noise, council members shouting over each other in disbelief and outrage, and it took several minutes for Zaravek to restore order. These are extraordinary claims, she said once the chamber had quieted. Present your evidence. Vexthar activated the holographic display he had prepared, filling the chamber with images from the Human History Museum. Humanity has spent its entire existence at war, he explained. Not against other species, but against itself. And the scale of destruction they have inflicted upon their own kind exceeds anything in Kelrani records. He showed them the trenches of the First World War, the firebombed cities of the Second, the mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They killed 85 million of their own people in a single conflict lasting 6 years, he continued. They developed weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets and used them against their own population centers. And they did all of this before ever leaving their homeworld. The council members watched in silence as image after image scrolled past, documenting humanity's long love affair with organized violence. This is madness, one of the younger council members said. No rational species would behave this way. Humanity is not entirely rational by Kelrani standards, Vexthar agreed. They are driven by emotions and ideologies that we would consider primitive. And they are capable of both tremendous cruelty and remarkable compassion, often within the same individual. He switched the display to show the combat training footage from West Point. They begin training their warriors as children, and by the age of 17, their soldiers are capable of defeating our combat drones in hand-to-hand fighting, he explained. They have studied our military doctrine extensively and developed countermeasures for every advantage we possess. The simulation results appeared next, showing the systematic destruction of a Kelrani invasion fleet in scenario after scenario. Their cadets achieve victory rates above 90% in war games against simulated Kelrani forces, Vexthar continued. They have developed tactics that exploit weaknesses in our standard formations that we did not even know existed. Zaravek's mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign of deep agitation that she normally kept under better control. "How is this possible?" she demanded. "They are an infant species with limited resources and no combat experience against spacefaring civilizations." "They do not need experience against other species," Vexstar replied. "They have thousands of years of experience fighting each other, and they have applied the lessons learned from that endless internal warfare to their preparations for eventual conflict with the wider galaxy." Deactivated the display and faced the Council directly. "Humans are insane by our standards, Counselor, and that insanity makes them the most dangerous species I have ever encountered." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They do not fight the way we fight, seeking decisive battles that demonstrate superiority and force submission, but instead they fight the way predators hunt, with patience and cunning and an absolute refusal to accept defeat." He thought of Colonel Santos and her tired eyes, of Cadet Kevin Brooks and his friendly smile that never quite reached those cold, calculating depths. "If we invade their territory, they will not surrender when we destroy their fleets or capture their colonies, but will instead scatter into the void and spend generations planning their revenge, striking at our supply lines and isolated outposts, bleeding us slowly until the cost of occupation exceeds any possible benefit." "Exterminate them entirely?" Zaravek asked. Vexstar shook his head. "They have already dispersed enough of their population to hidden locations that total extermination would be impossible, and the attempt would unite every human in existence into a single purpose: our destruction." He let that sink in before continuing. "They showed me their history willingly, Counselor, because they wanted me to understand exactly what we would be facing if we chose conflict over cooperation, and I believe their message was sincere." "What message?" Zaravek demanded. "That they do not want war with us, that they genuinely desire peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial alliance, but that if we force them to fight, they will destroy everything the Kelrani Dominion has built over the past 1,000 years. Vexstar bowed his head. "My recommendation is that we immediately offer humanity full alliance status with the most favorable terms we can manage. We establish comprehensive trade agreements and technology-sharing protocols, and that we pray to whatever gods we believe in that they accept our friendship." The chamber was silent for a long moment. "And if they refuse our offers?" Zaravek asked quietly. Vexstar looked up and met her gaze. "Then we run, Counselor, as far and as fast as we can, and we hope they do not follow." The debate that followed lasted for many hours, but in the end, the Council reached a unanimous decision. 3 cycles later, the Kelrani Dominion dispatched its most senior diplomatic delegation to Earth, with instructions to negotiate the most generous alliance treaty in Dominion history. The humans accepted. Commander Vexstar retired from active military service shortly after the alliance was formalized, citing a desire to pursue scholarly interests after his long career of conquest. He spent his remaining years writing extensively about the need for peaceful coexistence between species, and his memoirs became required reading at every Kelrani military academy. He never returned to Earth, but he kept a small holographic image on his desk until the day he died. It showed Cadet Kevin Brooks standing at attention with a friendly smile on his face, looking exactly like any young person from any civilization in the galaxy. But Vexstar had seen what lurked behind that smile, had watched this soft-looking child dismantle a combat drone with his bare hands, and he never forgot what the image truly represented. It was a reminder that peace was worth any price, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The Human Alliance and the Kelrani Dominion remained close allies for centuries afterward, their combined strength helping to stabilize an entire region of the galaxy and bring unprecedented prosperity to dozens of species. Historians would later credit Commander Vexstar's honest assessment with preventing a war that would have devastated both civilizations, and he was remembered as one of the great diplomats of his era. But Vexthar himself never accepted such praise. He knew the truth, that he had not chosen peace out of wisdom or compassion, but simply because he had looked into the eyes of humanity and seen something that terrified him to his core. He had seen a species that had spent thousands of years learning how to destroy itself, and had somehow survived every attempt. And he had understood with absolute certainty that any species capable of surviving its own worst impulses would have no difficulty whatsoever surviving the Kelrani Dominion. The humans had shown him their nature, and he had been wise enough to believe them. That was his legacy, and he was content with it. The image of Kevin Brooks smiled at him from his desk, friendly and young and absolutely merciless. Vexthar smiled back, grateful every single day that he would never have to face that smile across a battlefield. Peace was indeed worth any price, and humanity had taught him exactly how high that price could be.